made up, and they remain today in the Textus Receptus despite the fact that they have no manuscript support whatsoever, and indeed they're not even real Greek words. Also missing from the first two editions of Erasmus's Greek text was the famous Comma Johanneum, 1 John 5:7. When people objected to its absence in the first two versions of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, Erasmus wrote to his friend Bombasius in Rome and asked him to consult the Vatican manuscript. Upon hearing that this passage was absent in Vaticanus, Erasmus rather rashly promised that if it could be found in only one Greek manuscript, he would include it in the next edition of his Greek New Testament. One was quickly written up for the occasion, and Erasmus was forced to include it, despite his protests, in the third edition, which eventually became the basis of the Textus Receptus. So that is how 1 John 5:7, as it's found in the King James Version, ended up there. Now, on page 7 of Perfected or Perverted, Mr. Ward says, quote, "This line of text is written on vellum in classical Greek," referring to the Alexandrian text. "Remember, the New Testament was written on papyrus in Koine Greek," unquote. In reality, Mr. Ward was in error at this point and has admitted such to me in the phone conversation we had this week. Actually, all New Testament manuscripts are written in Koine Greek, which means common Greek. What confused Mr. Ward was the fact that the Alexandrian manuscript tradition contains more Atticisms than the other. Atticisms would be forms of the language that would be sort of like the classical Greek that was used in Greece. The earliest New Testament manuscripts, such as P52, P66, and most especially P75, are in reality all Alexandrian in text, and of course they're all written on papyri, even though Mr. Ward said that they are written on only vellum. On page 8, when talking about the Alexandrian text, Mr. Ward says, quote, "The story of this corrupt line starts with a man named Origen," unquote. This, too, is completely false. Indeed, as seen before, papyri manuscript P75 probably predates Origen's rise to prominence in Alexandria, yet it contains an Alexandrian text. So in other words, we have manuscripts in the New Testament that contain the Alexandrian text that were written before Origen was born. How could he possibly be the father of the Alexandrian text when we have texts that were written before the man was born that are Alexandrian? Truly unbelievable. In fact, in Famine in the Land on page 46, Mr. Ward follows the rather amazing error of Peter Ruckman in saying that the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was actually written by Origen. This is truly amazing because of the fact that the Septuagint is continuously quoted by Paul the Apostle, who lived 100 years and more, obviously more than 100 years, before Origen did. Scholars tell us that the Septuagint was translated 250 years before Christ. Even Jesus quoted from the Septuagint, so obviously Origen didn't write it. On page 10 of Perfected or Perverted, in big capital letters, I'd like to advise you, we read, quote, "Every Bible published today, except for the AV 1611, is based on the work of Westcott and Hort," unquote. Westcott and Hort come in for unbelievable vilification by the King James only people, even though, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think that Mr. Ward and most other King James only people have ever read anything that was written by Westcott and Hort. This is simply not true. Modern texts are not slavish reproductions of the Westcott and Hort text of 1881. They are much more eclectic and give much more weight to other readings than the readings given by the Westcott and Hort tradition and text. This kind of statement shows how little of the field is known by the King James Version only writers. On page 11, for example, of Perfected or Perverted, here we find a terribly unfair and equally inaccurate statement that has no other purpose than to attack Westcott and Hort. Let me read it to you. From the book it says, "Westcott and Hort's textual theory can be viewed by the Bible-believing Christian as resting on two ungodly assumptions. One, that sometime around the 4th century AD, Jesus Christ failed in his promise to preserve his words and the true text was lost. And two, that Westcott and Hort could recover this text by applying a man-made theory to the Word of God. This simply is not true. Westcott and Hort never said that the original readings were lost in the 4th century or anything like it. This is a rather sad statement, and I don't understand the reasons why King James Version only people have to attack Westcott and Hort and to attack their sincerity or anything else. Normally, I think it's because of a lack of solid data to back themselves up. On page 13 of Perfected or Perverted, here Mr. Ward cites two Greek scholars, Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Alland, as having demonstrated that the genealogical method as such has no application to New Testament textual criticism. This one truly amazed me because given that the cited Alland is the same Alland who is the editor of the Nestle Alland text, is the basis of the NIV and the NAS, it's obvious that Mr. Ward is somewhat confused concerning his Greek scholars. Dr. Caldwell never rejected that. Dr. Alland never rejects that. They do not reject the modern theory that just simply is historically sound. When people would translate or copy a manuscript, obviously they were copying a manuscript that someone else had copied. And the recognition of this is what is known as the genealogical method. And without going into a lot of detail on that, this just simply is the logical way of viewing how manuscripts came about. And the modern textual theories also recognize that there is such a thing as history. For example, the people who support the majority text, that is, well, you've got, let's say, 5,000 manuscripts, and you've got a variant reading, say, at, John 1:18. These people would say what you do is you count up the number of texts that read one way and count up the number of texts that read another way, and whoever has the most texts wins. In other words, you don't weigh text, you count them. If you have 4,500 to read one way and only 500 to read another way, well, the people with the 4,500 wins. And that sounds logical when at first you think about it. But when you think about it a little bit longer, you find out that doesn't make any sense at all. Why? Well, because about 90 to 95% of those texts come from one particular area, the area around Byzantium. That's why they're called Byzantine texts. Well, why is it that most of the texts have a Byzantine reading? Well, think about history. By the 4th century, most places except that area were no longer reading or using Greek. They were using other languages. So obviously the number of texts produced in other areas would drop off. And then remember what happened about the year 700? Remember the Muslims taking over most of the known world and wiping out most Greek-speaking areas except for the area around Byzantium? Byzantium withstood the Muslim attack until the 1400s. And so from the time of the writing of the New Testament until 1400 years, in one area you have people continuing to use Greek manuscripts. Is it any wonder that the particular text that was popular in that area comprises the majority of our manuscripts? Well, it's no wonder at all when you actually think about it. And so obviously you cannot simply